Late at night, the small police station was quiet. Officer Daniel sat at his desk, sipping coffee and finishing some paperwork. It had been a long day, and he was ready to go home. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. It was so faint that Daniel almost thought he imagined it. But then, the knock came again, this time, a little louder. Curious, he stood up and walked toward the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see a little girl standing outside. She was thin, barefoot, and wearing an oversized dress that barely reached her knees. Her hair was messy, and her big brown eyes were filled with fear. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, shivering in the cold night air. Daniel's heart tightened. Something was wrong. "Hey there," he said gently. "Are you lost?" The girl shook her head. She hesitated, looking around as if checking if someone was following her. Then, in a small, trembling voice, she said, "My stepmother makes me work all day. I can't do it anymore." Daniel frowned. He had handled many cases before, but there was something different about this child. She wasn't just lost, she was scared. "Come inside," he said, stepping aside. The girl hesitated again, but then she stepped forward. As she entered, Daniel noticed how weak she looked, like she hadn't eaten properly for days. He closed the door behind her and led her to a chair. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma, can you tell me what happened?" She bit her lip and looked down at her hands. "She makes me do everything," she said softly. "Cleaning, cooking, washing clothes, all day, every day. If I stop, she gets mad. She locks me in the storeroom." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Your father? Does he know?" Emma's fingers curled into a fist. "He doesn't do anything. He just listens to her." Daniel took a deep breath. He could see the pain in Emma's eyes, the exhaustion in her small frame. This wasn't just a complaint, this was something serious. "Emma," he said carefully, "how did you get here? Did you run away?" She nodded slowly. "I waited until everyone was asleep. Then I climbed out of the window and ran as fast as I could." Daniel leaned forward. "That was very brave of you." Emma's lips trembled, and her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know where to go," she admitted. "But I saw this place and thought, maybe you could help me." Daniel nodded firmly. "You did the right thing, Emma. You're safe now." But just as he was about to ask more questions, a loud noise came from outside. It was the sound of a car screeching to a stop. Emma gasped and grabbed the arms of the chair, her face turning pale. "She found me," she whispered. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He stood up and reached for his radio. Who had followed Emma here? And what would happen next? Emma's heart pounded as the sound of the screeching car filled the quiet night. She gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that her fingers turned white. Officer Daniel noticed the terror in her eyes. He moved quickly, stepping in front of her as if to shield her from whatever danger was outside. "Stay here," he said firmly. Emma shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "She found me." Daniel grabbed his radio. Officer Daniel requesting backup. Possible child endangerment case. Stay alert. Outside, the engine of the car roared again before turning off. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Footsteps echoed on the pavement. Slow, heavy, purposeful. Emma felt like she couldn't breathe. Every step outside sounded like a countdown to something terrible. A loud knock shook the police station's door. Daniel glanced at Emma. She was trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring nod before stepping toward the door. "Who's there?" he called out. A woman's voice responded, sharp and desperate. "Officer, please, open the door. I need help." Emma gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. It was her stepmother. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He could sense the urgency in the woman's voice, but something felt off. He turned back to Emma and whispered, "Stay out of sight." Emma quickly slipped behind a cabinet, her small body curling into itself as she tried to disappear. Daniel unlocked the door and opened it slightly, just enough to see the woman standing outside. She looked worried, her face pale under the streetlights. "Officer, please," she cried. "My stepdaughter ran away. She's only 8. I'm so scared. She could be in danger." Daniel studied her carefully. She was well dressed, her makeup flawless, her voice trembling with emotion. To an ordinary person, she would seem like a heartbroken mother. But Daniel wasn't fooled. "Your stepdaughter?" he asked calmly. "What's her name?" "Emma," the woman said immediately. "She's a sweet little girl, but she gets scared easily. I don't know why she ran away. I've always treated her like my own." Behind the cabinet, Emma clenched her fists. "Lies." Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "And you have no idea why she left?" The woman sighed dramatically. "I try my best, officer. But you know how children are. Sometimes they just act out." Emma's eyes burned with tears. "Act out? Is that what Clara thought of her pain?" Daniel remained silent for a moment, then finally said, "Wait here." He turned back inside, locking the door behind him. He walked over to Emma and crouched down beside her. "She says she's worried about you," he whispered. "She says she treats you well." Emma wiped her tears and looked straight into his eyes. "She's lying." Daniel took a deep breath. He already knew that. Now, he had to decide his next move. But before he could, the knocking on the door grew louder. More urgent. More impatient. Emma covered her ears. The nightmare wasn't over yet. The knocking at the door grew louder. Clara's voice turned sharp. "Officer, please. Open the door. I need to find Emma before something bad happens." Emma curled up tighter behind the cabinet, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that voice too well. It was the same voice that ordered her to clean, to work, to stay silent. The same voice that told her she was worthless. Officer Daniel remained calm. He glanced at the door, then back at Emma. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered. "Tell me everything. I need to know the truth." Emma swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she wiped her tears. "She makes me do all the work," she whispered. "Since my mom died, she treats me like a servant. Cooking, cleaning, washing, everything." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What happens if you refuse?" Emma lowered her head. "She locks me in the storeroom. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes all night." Her voice broke. "No food. No water. Just the dark." Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. "And your father?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "He doesn't do anything. He just listens to her. He never helps me." A sharp pain twisted in Daniel's chest. He had heard stories like this before, but every time, it made him sick. A child, abandoned in her own home, suffering in silence. The knocking turned into banging. Clara's voice rose. "Officer, please, let me in. I need to take my daughter home." Emma stiffened. Daughter. That word felt so wrong. Daniel stood up. He had heard enough. He pulled out his radio. "This is Officer Daniel. I have a possible child abuse case. Requesting immediate assistance." Emma looked up at him with wide eyes. "You believe me?" Daniel knelt beside her, his expression firm. "Of course, I do." Emma's breath hitched. No one had ever said that to her before. Then, a new voice came from outside. A deep, unfamiliar voice. Step away from the door." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Someone else was out there. Daniel stood, placing a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "Stay here. I'll handle this." As he walked toward the door, Emma felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Could this really be the end of her nightmare? Or was it just the beginning of something worse? The door unlocked with a click. The moment of truth had arrived. The door creaked open slightly, and Officer Daniel stepped outside. The cold night air carried the tension between him and the woman standing in front of him. Clara's face was twisted with worry. At least, that's what she wanted him to believe. Behind her, a tall man in uniform stood with his arms crossed. It was Officer Reed, one of Daniel's colleagues. "We need to ask you a few questions," Reed said, his voice firm. Clara's eyes darted between the two officers. "Of course. But please, let me take Emma home first. She must be so scared." Daniel didn't move. "Where was the last place you saw Emma?" Clara sighed, placing a hand on her chest as if she were exhausted. "At home, sleeping in her room. I woke up and she was gone. I was so scared." "She's just a child, officer. She doesn't know what she's doing." Daniel studied her carefully. Every word sounded rehearsed, too perfect, too polished. He had seen this kind of act before. Her room, he asked. What does it look like? Clara blinked. Excuse me. Describe it, Daniel said. Her bed, her toys, her belongings. What does her room look like? Clara's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Then, she recovered quickly. Well, you see, Emma is a simple child. She doesn't ask for much. Daniel cut her off. Does she have her own bed? Clara froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Reed stepped forward. We're going to need you to come with us for further questioning. Clara's fake concern turned to panic. Wait. You don't understand. Emma is troubled. She lies. A small voice interrupted her. She's lying. Clara spun around. Emma stood in the doorway, her small frame barely visible under the dim station lights. She looked straight at Clara, her fear replaced with something stronger, determination. She doesn't let me sleep in a bed, Emma said, her voice clear but shaky. I sleep in the storeroom. On the floor. Clara's face turned pale. Emma, sweetheart, that's not true. You know I love you. No, you don't, Emma whispered. The air grew thick with silence. Clara's mask was cracking. Daniel crossed his arms. We'll be verifying everything. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but this time, she had nothing to say. Behind her, Officer Reed pulled out his radio. Dispatch, we have a situation. Clara's perfect lie had finally fallen apart. And Emma, for the first time in years, she felt something new. Hope. Clara's face twisted with desperation. She took a shaky step toward Emma, but Daniel quickly stepped between them. That's enough, he said firmly. Emma didn't move. She stood still, her small fists clenched by her sides. For the first time in years, she wasn't running, hiding, or obeying orders out of fear. She was standing up to the woman who had made her life a nightmare. Clara's voice softened, turning into a pleading tone. Emma, sweetheart, you don't understand. I was just trying to teach you responsibility. Emma's eyes didn't waver. No. You were trying to break me. The station fell silent. Even Officer Reed seemed taken aback by the strength in Emma's voice. Clara's fake concern vanished. Her eyes darkened with anger. You ungrateful little... Reed interrupted sharply, stepping forward. We're done here. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Clara's expression changed again. This time, real panic spread across her face. Wait. No. This is a mistake. You can't do this to me. Daniel ignored her and looked down at Emma. Do you want to press charges? He asked gently. Emma hesitated. For so long, she had been powerless. But now, she had a choice. A voice. She took a deep breath. Yes. That one word sealed Clara's fate. Reed grabbed Clara's wrists and locked the cuffs around them. She screamed, twisted, and tried to pull away, but there was no escape. This isn't fair. She's lying. My husband will come for me. He'll be questioned too, Daniel said coldly. Clara's face went pale. Emma watched as Clara was led outside to the waiting police car. The woman who had tormented her for years was now powerless. The night air felt lighter. Daniel turned back to Emma. You're safe now, he said. Emma's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in a long time, she let out a breath without fear. But then, a thought hit her. She looked up at Daniel with wide eyes. What happens to me now? Daniel crouched down to her level. We'll find you a safe place, he promised. Somewhere you'll be cared for. But you're not alone anymore, Emma. Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. For now, all she knew was that the nightmare was finally over. Or was it? The police car's flashing lights faded into the night as Clara was taken away. Emma watched until it disappeared from sight, her heart still racing. She had dreamed of this moment, escaping, telling the truth, seeing Clara taken away in handcuffs. But now that it had happened, an unfamiliar feeling crept into her chest. What now? Officer Daniel knelt beside her, his voice calm and steady. You did the right thing, Emma. Emma nodded slowly, but doubt lingered in her mind. The only life she had ever known was filled with orders, punishments, and fear. Now, all of that was gone. But what came next? Reed walked up, speaking softly to Daniel. I called Child Protective Services. They'll find a place for her. Emma's stomach twisted. A new place. New people. A foster home. What if they were like Clara? What if they were worse? Daniel must have seen the fear in her eyes. Listen, Emma, he said gently. We won't let anything happen to you. I promise. Emma bit her lip. She wanted to believe him, but promises never meant anything in her world. Just then, the station door swung open. A woman in a grey coat stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. She had a kind face, but Emma didn't trust it. Emma, Daniel said softly, this is Mrs. Thompson. She works with CPS. The woman smiled. Hello, Emma. I know this is a lot to take in, but we're going to find you a safe and loving home. Emma stared at her, unsure of what to say. Safe and loving? Those words felt too distant, too unreal. Mrs. Thompson crouched down, her voice gentle. Do you have any family? Anyone who might take care of you? Emma shook her head. Her real mother was gone. Her father had already chosen Clara over her. There was no one. Daniel's expression darkened. She's been through enough, he said. She needs somewhere she can heal. Mrs. Thompson nodded. We'll make sure she's placed with the right people. The right people. Emma wanted to believe her. But deep inside, another fear was growing. What if she was just walking into another nightmare? Emma sat in the backseat of Mrs. Thompson's car, staring out of the window as the city lights blurred past. The police station, Officer Daniel, Clara's angry voice, all of it was behind her now. But instead of relief, she felt a heavy knot in her stomach. She had escaped one prison. But was she walking into another? Mrs. Thompson glanced at her through the rearview mirror. You must be tired, she said kindly. It's been a long night. Emma didn't respond. She kept her hands tightly folded in her lap, bracing herself for whatever came next. After what felt like forever, the car pulled up to a small white house with a porch light glowing softly. Emma's breath hitched. It looked normal. Nothing like Clara's cold, dark home. Mrs. Thompson turned to her. This is the Carter family's house. They're foster parents, and they've taken in children before. They're very kind, Emma. Kind. That word meant nothing to Emma anymore. Mrs. Thompson stepped out and walked around to open Emma's door. Come on, let's meet them. Emma hesitated. A part of her wanted to run, to disappear into the night, to be anywhere but here. But where would she go? Slowly, she slid out of the car, her heart pounding. The front door opened before they even knocked. A woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile stepped out. You must be Emma, she said softly. I'm Mrs. Carter. We've been expecting you. Emma stiffened, her feet frozen to the ground. The woman seemed nice, but so had Clara, at first. Then, a man appeared behind her. Welcome, Emma, he said. I'm Mr. Carter. His voice was calm, steady. But Emma wasn't fooled. Adults always acted nice in front of others. She glanced past them, looking into the house. It was bright and warm. A fireplace crackled in the living room. On the walls, there were pictures, smiling children, happy moments frozen in time. It looked too perfect. Mrs. Carter noticed her hesitation. Would you like to come inside? Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to say no, but she had nowhere else to go. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The house smelled like cinnamon and something baking in the oven. A small brown dog wagged its tail and sniffed her feet. It didn't bark or growl, it just sat beside her, as if waiting for her to feel safe. Mrs. Carter closed the door gently. You don't have to be afraid here, Emma. Emma didn't answer, because deep inside, she wasn't sure she would ever feel safe again. She had survived Clara, but could she ever learn to trust again?